They said his military days were over, until a newborn cried in the snow. A loyal dog guarded the child, as if protecting the last spark of hope on earth. He didn't know their names, but their fate chose him, and God was watching. This is the story of a heart reborn through love, faith, and sacrifice. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Winter presses down on Anchorage like a silent weight. Streets empty, wind snarls through alleyways, snow masks both footsteps and intentions. The harbor lights shimmer faintly through fog, revealing just enough to remind the lonely they are still seen. Jacob Miller had long believed winter was just a season, not a presence. Yet tonight, as his truck rolled through the slushy streets at the edge of Anchorage, he felt it breathing, cold, heavy, intrusive, like a memory he could not ignore. He gripped the steering wheel firmly, as though the road might suddenly vanish beneath him. The hum of the heater filled the cabin, but warmth seemed unable to reach him fully. Not since the day everything he'd once fought for had slipped through his fingers and into silence. The city slept. Most lights had gone dark hours ago, save for a few stubborn windows where life still clenched its fists and refused surrender. Jacob understood those windows more than anything else in this town. He understood refusal, he understood persistence, and he understood what it meant to keep breathing when you no longer quite believed in your own pulse. His uniform, NWU Type 3, still felt familiar on his shoulders, not tight, not loose, just present, like a hand on his back reminding him of what he used to be. The boots scuffed the floor of the truck each time he shifted his feet, almost a whisper of former deployments, former orders, former purpose. 45 wasn't old, he knew that, but it felt like an age where many things had already been taken and only a few still lingered, stubbornly clinging to a man's ribs. Jacob lowered the window slightly and let cold air rush in. The sting grounded him, kept the fog of memory from consuming everything. He didn't like remembering too much at once. It was like letting water swell behind a dam. Eventually, something cracked. Tonight, he needed to keep the dam intact. He drove with no destination past the shoreline, past the harbor where fishing boats waited for seasons more forgiving than this one, past the abandoned warehouse district where stray lights blinked like nervous beacons. Every turn felt instinctive. His hands knew the wheel even when his mind drifted. He tried not to think of the day he had left the Navy, tried not to picture the hospital corridor, the sympathetic looks, the handshakes that expressed gratitude but didn't understand what came afterward. Civilians thought discharge meant freedom, but to Jacob it meant losing a map he'd used his whole adult life. And without a map, even the strongest legs wandered. His thoughts drifted to the notion of home. Not a physical one. He had an apartment with a view of the sea and neighbors who tried to smile, unaware of the weight behind his silence. No, he wondered about the home inside his chest, the one that used to contain more than ghosts. That home had been quiet for far too long. A red light halted him at an intersection where no other car waited. Snow sifted across the windshield like powdered glass. Jacob took a slow breath, cracked his knuckles, gave himself permission to think for just a moment. Would anything ever change? Would he always be the man who kept moving because stopping meant remembering? Was he still of use to anyone? Anything? The questions felt old, but they still cut deep. The light changed, and he accelerated. A sudden flash at the edge of his vision made him lift his foot again, something moving along the side of the road, not large, not slow, determined. Jacob narrowed his eyes. At first he thought it was just debris kicked up by the storm, but the shape angled sideways into the street before darting back, as though testing its surroundings. His instincts sharpened instantly, the dormant soldier in him waking without permission. He pulled over, tires crunching through ice. He waited a moment, listening, letting the wind carry hints of what hid beyond the reach of headlights. Nothing. Then, Again, movement. Closer. Jacob stepped out of the truck, boots sinking into snow. The wind gnawed at his exposed face, but he hardly noticed. Something tugged at him, a feeling he couldn't name, a presence. A quiet woof of breath broke the air. From behind a dumpster near an old brick laundromat, a German shepherd emerged, low to the ground, cautious, eyes focused on him with unwavering alertness. Not fear, something else. Something like calculation, like resolve. Jacob held still, chest tightening with an instinctive respect he did not expect. The dog stood between him and something wrapped in a thick cloth bundle resting in the snow. Its body angled, its head tilted slightly, as if measuring Jacob's soul before deciding whether to let him near. The dog gave nothing away, no whine, no bark, no snap. Just silence, and a presence that felt more human than many he'd known. Jacob felt something stir in his chest, faint but real. "Someone has trusted you before," the feeling whispered. "But someone might be trusting you now." He crouched, not too low, not too fast, just enough to make himself smaller. The snow soaked quickly into the knees of his pants, but he kept his gaze steady. "I'm not here to take anything," he murmured, unsure why his voice came out softer than usual. The dog held his eyes. Snow fell. Jacob's breath steamed in the air. The feeling in his chest grew unfamiliar, almost painful, like hope, but not quite. Something shifted among the cloth at the dog's feet. A tiny sound, fragile, choked, broke through the wind. Jacob's pulse leapt, breath catching. That sound was unmistakable, the weak, trembling cry of a human infant. He froze, not out of shock, but out of recognition. The kind of recognition that comes when destiny circles back after waiting too long. The cry was faint, but filled with a strength that said, "I am alive, but I will not be for long if no one answers." Jacob felt heat rise behind his sternum, that old ache for duty flaring like an ember long buried beneath ash. Not military duty, not patriotic duty, something older, something simpler. A life is asking for help. And once upon a time, Jacob Miller never ignored that call. He reached a hand forward, not touching the bundle, not reaching for the dog, just placing his palm open over the snow, letting intention speak for him. The dog stiffened, chest expanding with a deep, warning inhale. Jacob whispered, barely audible, "Let me help. I don't know who left the child, but I know what it means to be abandoned." The wind howled down the street like a beast denied. The dog didn't move, didn't blink. Then, finally, its gaze softened just enough that Jacob felt the world tilt. The infant whimpered again. And in that moment, under the frozen breath of Anchorage, Jacob Miller understood that the night had stopped belonging to his memories. It now belonged to responsibility, to possibility, to two lives that didn't yet know they needed him. He knelt deeper into the snow, hands steady, heart racing, past and present, colliding like ice floes in the harbor. He whispered once more, less to the dog than to himself, "I won't walk away." And the dog, without sound, took one step back from the bundle. The wind did not ease. The snow did not stop. But something inside Jacob finally did. For the first time in years, the world asked him to step forward, not as a soldier, not as a ghost, but as a man who could lift someone else from the cold. He exhaled slowly, reached toward the bundle, and chapter 1 ends before his fingers touched the cloth. Snow pressed against the windows as Jacob carried the bundled infant inside his small apartment overlooking the harbor, the door clicking shut behind him with the soft certainty of a choice already made. He set the bundle gently atop the couch cushions closest to the heater, fingers trembling more than the icy wind could justify, and Rex followed in slow, measured steps, instincts tuned to every sound, breath, and movement around the child. Jacob's heart hammered with the weight of responsibility he had not sought yet, could not refuse, and as he unwrapped the cloth enough to check the baby's breathing, he felt something inside him shift, a return of an emotion he once buried beneath years of exhaustion and self-preservation. The child's tiny hands curled weakly, a fragile declaration of life, and Jacob wondered who had abandoned such innocence to the mercy of winter. What desperate shape of life led someone to believe that the night would be kinder than people? He reheated the air in the room, adjusting the space heater and checking for drafts, feeling the old military instinct of rapid assessment kicking in uninvited, the same instinct that once kept his team alive through sandstorms and gunfire. Rex positioned himself between Jacob and the door, as if ensuring no one could interrupt the moment, his loyalty not given, but earned through circumstance and silent understanding, and Jacob sensed a history in the dog's unwavering posture, as though somewhere in its past, Rex had learned that protecting the vulnerable was not just instinct but purpose. The baby cried again, a thin but persistent sound that pierced through Jacob's chest with a clarity stronger than memory, and he found himself recalling a night years ago during deployment, when he held a wounded teenage recruit's hand and promised they would go home together, a promise shattered by an unexpected detonation the next morning. That memory had driven Jacob to believe any vow he made afterward would bring ruin, yet tonight he could not walk away. He forced himself to breathe slowly, reminding his pulse that fear was not the enemy here, that the cold outside was powerless as long as he stayed warm enough inside himself to act. With careful hands, he fed the infant warm milk he prepared from emergency supplies left in his cabinet, remnants of a time he believed he might one day host visitors but never did. And as the child's crying softened into faint breathing, Jacob felt the first tremor of hope, a sensation both terrifying and familiar. He caught his reflection in the window, the uniform still hanging from his shoulders like a memory refusing to fade, and he wondered if he was clinging to the past, or if the past was clinging to him, refusing to let him drift too far from who he once was. Rex moved closer to the couch, lowering his head near the bundle without touching it, radiating an unspoken promise that Jacob recognized not in words, but in silence, and Jacob whispered something not to Rex or the baby, but to the empty space between them, the part of his soul that still doubted he deserved to save anyone. The harbor lights flickered in the distance, and through their glow, Jacob noticed a pair of footprints near his building, half buried by falling snow, too large to belong to a child and too fresh to dismiss as coincidence. Someone else knew about the baby, and they might not be finished searching. A sudden knock at a neighboring door startled him, not a threat but a reminder that the city was not asleep even when it pretended to be. And Jacob realized how precarious his situation had become. He had rescued life from winter, but winter was not the only danger stalking Anchorage's forgotten corners. As dawn tinted the sky with faint blue, Jacob wrapped the now sleeping baby more securely and studied Rex, who stared back with a quiet alertness that needed no translation. The dog understood that choices have consequences, and Jacob knew he had stepped into a story much larger than he first imagined. He sat beside the couch and allowed himself a moment of stillness, but just as his breathing steadied, the heater flickered and the apartment lights dimmed, signaling a power issue that should not have happened on a calm morning. Jacob's muscles tensed on instinct as he stared at the darkening room, because sudden power loss in winter was never just inconvenience in Anchorage. Sometimes it was warning. The power had returned before sunrise, but the brief blackout lingered in Jacob's mind like an unfinished sentence as he drove toward the small clinic near downtown, the bundled infant secured in a carrier on the passenger seat, and Rex curled in the back, alert despite the motion of the truck. The streets were slushy now instead of fully frozen, a thin sheen of thaw disguising the same hard ice beneath, and Jacob could not help but feel the metaphor digging at him. Things only looked softer on the surface, but nothing truly changed underneath unless someone forced it. He glanced at the baby, who had finally fallen into a shallow, uneasy sleep, and wondered how many decisions made by strangers had led the child to a freezing sidewalk guarded by a dog whose past he did not know. Responsibility used to arrive in the form of orders, clear and loud, wrapped in radio static and chain of command. Now it came wrapped in cloth, small enough to fit in his arms, but heavy enough to tilt the axis of his life. He parked outside the clinic, a modest building tucked between a grocery store and a laundromat, the kind of place that saw more working-class colds and minor injuries than emergencies. The familiarity of its plain facade did little to soothe the knot in his chest. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed with a sterility he associated with briefing rooms and medical tents, and the faint smell of antiseptic clawed at memories he had tried hard to keep buried. A receptionist with tired eyes looked up, took in the carrier, the uniform, and the dog sitting obediently by the door, and decided questions could wait until the doctor. Jacob appreciated that. He found a seat near a corner, Rex settling beside his boots with ears slightly raised, eyes always returning to the carrier as if counting the baby's breaths. Jacob's thoughts, however, wandered through darker alleys. He remembered another clinic, this one overseas, where he had stood in blood-spattered clothes while surgeons fought to save a local child caught in crossfire. He had promised the boy's father that everything possible would be done. Everything had been done. It had not been enough. That failure had taught Jacob something he hated knowing, that sometimes effort and outcome did not care about each other, and that promises, once spoken, had a way of poisoning you when the world refused to cooperate. The door to the examination room opened, and a man in his 50s stepped out. A doctor Jacob dimly recognized from previous minor visits, the kind of physician who knew how to work quickly with people who did not have the luxury of time or money. "Mr. Miller," the doctor said calmly, acknowledging him with a nod that suggested he remembered more than Jacob expected. "Reception said you have a baby that needs looking at." The words felt surreal, a baby that needs looking at. As though he had just found a stray umbrella, not a human life, between life and death. He followed the doctor into the small exam room, his chest tightening with each step. Rex stayed in the waiting area, body coiled but patient, eyes following Jacob until the door closed. Inside, the doctor asked only what was necessary. Where did you find the baby? How long had it been in the cold? Had it shown signs of difficulty breathing or feeding? Jacob answered truthfully where he could and carefully where he could not. He confessed the snow, the late hour, the lack of any adult nearby. He did not mention the footprints near his building or the dog standing guard over the bundle as if it had already fought off something worse than frost. He convinced himself that omitting those details was not lying, just postponing a part of the story until he knew it would matter. The doctor examined the infant with a quiet professionalism that somehow made Jacob's heart pound even harder. Stethoscope against tiny chest, fingers lightly checking pulse and skin temperature, brief tests of reflexes. Jacob watched, every nerve wired to the rhythm of the doctor's movements. It felt like waiting for a verdict. "The child is undernourished and chilled," the doctor finally said, writing a few notes with a pen that had seen many long days. "But you got the baby warm in time. I do not see signs of severe frostbite or immediate organ failure. We will need to monitor, but there is a good chance for full recovery if the next days are stable." Good chance. Stable recovery. 3 words that together should have sounded like salvation, yet Jacob felt them land with unsettling weight. If the next days were stable. If whoever had left the child did not come back with other ideas. If this was simply a story of abandonment and not something uglier. "What are you planning to do, Mr. Miller?" the doctor asked, looking at him with a gaze that seemed to understand Jacob was not one to stumble into responsibilities on a whim. "Social services will need to be notified. This child cannot just disappear into someone's apartment, no matter how well-intentioned. Jacob knew the man was right, and yet the mention of systems and agencies awakened a reflexive wariness. He had seen bureaucracy misplace people, misinterpret situations, misjudge threats. He had seen decisions made far away, based on incomplete information, ruin lives on the ground. But he also knew he could not keep the child hidden like contraband. That was how good intentions curdled into something else. "Notify them," Jacob said quietly, surprising himself with the calm in his voice. "But for now, can I keep the baby with me, at least until we know more?" The doctor considered him for a moment, then nodded once, perhaps recalling previous interactions where Jacob had been more helpful than harmful. "I will document everything and make it clear you brought the baby in immediately," he replied. "That matters. People like to assume the worst. Sometimes they are right. Sometimes they are lazy." There was a brief silence, filled only by the soft sounds of the infant, who had begun to fuss again, as if resenting being the center of so much attention. Jacob reached out, almost without thinking, and let a finger brush the child's small hand. The baby's fingers curled around his instinctively, not as symbolic gesture, but as raw survival. Something inside Jacob's chest clenched. He remembered a field briefing when his commanding officer had said that some missions would not be about eliminating threats, but about preserving fragile assets. He had not realized then the assets could be as small as this. Returning to the waiting room with the carrier, he found Rex exactly where he had left him, gaze fixed on the door as if willing it to open. The dog's posture relaxed by a fraction when he saw Jacob with the child still in his arms, and Jacob wondered what kind of losses lived in that animal's memory to make him so attuned to the risk of disappearance. On the drive back, the sky brighter now with a pale, washed-out sun, Jacob tried to think logically. The child would be reported, paperwork would move, people would ask questions. Maybe they would find a desperate mother who had made a terrible decision. Maybe they would uncover something darker. He did not know which possibility frightened him more. At a red light, he glanced over at the passenger seat. The baby, temporarily content, stared at nothing with wide, unfocused eyes. Jacob felt the weight of all the things this child did not yet know. That the world could be both cruel and kind, and the line between those states was often drawn by people who were tired, scared, or greedy. That sometimes salvation came not from saints or heroes, but from strangers who happened to be too stubborn to drive away. Back at his apartment, the power held steady, but Jacob's distrust of the earlier outage remained. He checked his fuse box, the hallway, even exchanged a few casual words with a neighbor who complained about flickering lights on other floors. It could have been nothing. It could have been everything. Inside, while the baby rested, Jacob knelt beside Rex and finally unclipped the dog's collar to examine it more closely. The metal tag bore the name he had already guessed, Rex, but there was also a shallow row of numbers and letters etched beneath, irregularly spaced, as if added later by a different hand. At first he thought it might be some form of outdated registration code, but as he wrote the sequence on a scrap of paper, a pattern tugged at him. The combination looked familiar, not as military coordinates, but as part of a grid system used on a local logistics map he had once seen for the harbor and warehouse district. A cold awareness slid through him. He fetched an old folded map from a drawer, remnants of a time he liked knowing every possible route around the city, and traced the code. The intersection it pointed to sat near the waterfront, at the edge of an old industrial block where he had once delivered spare parts as a favor for a mechanic. The same area he had passed last night without a second thought. The same area he now could not ignore. Rex watched him with complete focus, as if recognizing that their shared pasts were tightening into a single path. "Is that where you came from?" Jacob murmured, more to himself than to the dog. "Is that where someone decided a baby was easier to leave outside than to keep inside. The idea made his stomach twist. He understood operational sacrifices in war zones. He could almost forgive choices made in split seconds under fire. But abandoning a child in the snow felt like something else entirely, something colder than any winter. The rational part of his mind told him to wait for authorities, to trust that official channels, once alerted, would handle things with more resources and legal authority than he possessed. Another part, older and more primal, remembered times when waiting had cost lives, times when delayed action became silent complicity. As afternoon sagged into early evening, the sky dimming again, Jacob layered the baby in warm clothes, secured the carrier, and checked his truck. He told himself he was only going to drive by the location, only to look to confirm that his gut was overreacting. He did not quite believe himself. Before they left, he set the carrier on the table and knelt so he was level with Rex. "Stay," he said softly. "Guard." Rex resisted for a second, eyes flicking between Jacob and the baby with clear conflict, then settled beside the table, muscles tight but compliant. Trust, Jacob realized, was now flowing in all directions within this apartment, binding man, dog, and child with threads that had not existed days before. At the door, hand on the knob, he hesitated and looked back. The scene was simple, a dog watching over a sleeping infant in a small Anchorage apartment. Yet to Jacob, it felt like a line he could not cross lightly. Once he stepped outside to follow that code on the collar, he was not just a man who had happened to find a baby in the snow. He was a participant in whatever story was unfolding. He shut the door behind him and walked down the stairs, the chill in the stairwell, biting at his resolve, but not breaking it. The engine started with a reluctant growl, and as he pulled away from the curb, a dark-colored vehicle 2 blocks down eased away from the opposite side of the street, its movement slow, unhurried, and entirely too synchronized with his. Wind carried the smell of salt and rust through the narrow alleys of the industrial district as Jacob parked his truck a block away from the coordinates decoded from Rex's collar. The newborn resting in the carrier strapped gently against his chest, its warmth anchoring him to a sense of purpose he was still afraid to name. The old warehouses rose like silent frozen giants, brick walls coated with frost, loading docks sagging under the weight of disuse, metal doors rattling softly with each gust, and Jacob felt memory crowd his mind, recalling outposts overseas where abandoned structures never meant abandonment but concealment, where shadows hid wounded soldiers waiting for extraction or insurgents waiting for targets. He scanned the perimeter without moving far from the truck, the infants breathing a rhythmic reminder that caution was no longer just instinct, but necessity, and he caught himself adjusting the carrier as though shielding the child from a world too sharp for its fragile presence. His boots crunched on frozen gravel as he walked toward a narrow path between 2 warehouses, the air colder here, as though winter pooled in the spaces people forgot, and each step forced him to confront the reasons he could not wait for authorities. Urgency burned in his chest, not driven by recklessness, but by the accumulating awareness that someone had left this baby outside, and someone else might come looking. In the middle of the alley, Jacob stopped where the numbers on his map aligned with the corner of a faded loading ramp, his breath hanging in the air as he studied the ground. Beneath crumbled frost and tire marks, he noticed a patch of disturbed gravel, as if something heavy had been dragged or loaded nearby, and a faint trace of fabric snagged on the corner of a rusted railing suggested hurried movement. He felt the silent weight of the infant against him and wondered if this place was where desperation met opportunity or danger met neglect. A distant mechanical hum echoed through the alley, and Jacob tensed, instinct triggering before reason. He edged back toward a stack of empty crates and crouched behind them, adjusting the carrier so the baby remained supported against his chest, and watched as a small vehicle rolled into view at the far end of the alley, headlights off, engine idling low. For a moment he thought it was the same dark car that followed him earlier, but the shape was different, more compact, its windows tinted poorly enough that silhouettes were visible inside. Two figures sat in front, motionless, their heads angled forward as though searching for something familiar. Jacob's pulse surged, not from fear, but from the sobering realization that small details meant big consequences. They were not lost, not wandering, not curious. They were looking. He pulled his gaze away from the vehicle long enough to check the baby, whose eyes fluttered with restless dreams, and Jacob felt a tenderness ripple through him that clashed with the gritty world around them. He could not explain why, but the child's presence felt like a lifeline tossed to a man who stopped believing he deserved rescue. The car rolled forward, tires hissing on ice, and as it passed a pool of light from a distant street lamp, Jacob caught a glimpse of the passenger holding something rectangular, flipping through pages quickly, too quickly for notes, almost like scanning photographs. His stomach tightened. If they had photos, they had history, and if they had history, they had motive. He forced himself to memorize every detail, the rhythm of the engine, the uneven paint job on the doors, the partial license digits he caught in the corner of his vision, because habit taught him that information was survival. When the car disappeared around the bend, Jacob waited longer than his nerves wanted, staying still until silence pressed in around him again. Only then did he stand, breath steadying, and debate his next move: go deeper into the district, return home to Rex, or contact authorities. Each option carried consequences he could not yet weigh with certainty. He walked slowly toward the docks and stopped at a chain-link fence, partially collapsed from age. Beyond it lay the quiet waterfront, vessels barely visible through mist, their masts swaying like tired sentinels. The stillness there felt wrong, as though something had recently disturbed the pattern of comings and goings. A sudden cry from the baby startled him, small but sharp enough to ricochet off the warehouse walls, and Jacob gently rocked the carrier to soothe the infant, his mind wrestling with conflicting impulses: protect, investigate, withdraw, advance. He remembered a briefing years ago when his commanding officer told him that doubt was not weakness but awareness, and that moving forward despite doubt was where purpose lived. The baby quieted again, breath shallow but steady, and Jacob whispered a soft reassurance, a promise without words. Turning back toward his truck, he felt a prickling along his spine, not the echo of paranoia, but the unmistakable awareness of being observed. And when he reached the corner of the alley, he saw a silhouette watching from a second-story warehouse window, too far and too shadowed to identify, yet unmistakably human. The figure moved away from the glass before Jacob could react, and a blaze of instinct flashed through him. If someone was watching now, they were watching because they had something to hide or something to reclaim. The thought struck him harder than expected. Reclaim. The baby shifted again, and Jacob felt the weight of that possibility sink deeper. What if the child was not abandoned but taken, then lost, then found again by accident? His throat tightened with a mix of resolve and dread. He had retrieved life from snow, but retrieving truth felt heavier. The sky darkened further as he reached his truck, the first flakes of a new snowfall drifting down like white dust settling over old wounds, and as he secured the baby in the passenger seat, he noticed fresh tire tracks trailing across the lot, not from his vehicle or the one he saw earlier. Someone else had been here recently, someone careful enough not to leave more than faint traces. Starting the engine, Jacob cast one more look toward the industrial block before pulling away, and as the warehouse windows receded into darkness, he sensed the story unfolding around him was not driven only by fate or coincidence, but by choices made in rooms he had not yet entered. The baby stirred again, and Jacob whispered a steadying breath, telling himself the next steps would be deliberate, not rushed. But as he turned onto the main road, the reflection of headlights caught his rearview mirror, a car trailing at just the right distance to avoid suspicion, yet too consistent to ignore, and Jacob felt the old familiar tension settle into his shoulders. Pursuit was no longer theoretical. Wind swept through the parking lot as Jacob guided the truck into its usual space, engine ticking with lingering heat, while the cold pressed harder from every direction. He shut off the ignition but didn't move immediately, hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling the weight of choices gather like frost along the edges of his conscience. The infant slept in uneven breaths beside him, bundled securely, unaware of the shadows stretching across the city or the quiet persistence of the car that followed him earlier. Jacob's instincts whispered that whoever trailed him had not abandoned their interest. Pursuit did not simply evaporate when headlights vanished. Someone was measuring distance and timing with caution, and caution usually hid motive. He stepped out with deliberate calm, scanning the street without turning his head, a habit long practiced in places where attention invited danger. Only distant traffic hummed along the main avenue, though he sensed the quiet too easily could disguise movement. Inside the apartment building, the stairwell lights flickered again, but held steady, the glow faint enough to make every shadow seem purposeful. Jacob ascended with slow steps, mindful of his balance while carrying the infant, and paused outside his door, listening. Nothing stirred within, yet silence alone meant little. He unlocked the door, entered, and froze just long enough to register that Rex had remained exactly where commanded, positioned near the table, head slightly lowered, gaze lifted toward Jacob with a calm intensity that told him the dog had not spent the hours idly. Rex shifted only when Jacob whispered, "Permission," and the dog moved close to the baby with a soft rumble of recognition, as though verifying that the world returning through the doorway was the same one that left. Jacob secured the apartment, checking locks and curtains with controlled motions, not out of paranoia, but preparation. The baby stirred as he lifted the carrier straps, and for a moment Jacob felt the fragile body lean into his chest with unconscious trust. That sensation carved deeper into him than any scar accumulated from service. He placed the infant gently into a makeshift crib fashioned from blankets and a sturdy wooden drawer lined with cushions, improvised yet safe, and watched until breathing steadied again. Rex nudged closer to Jacob, as if urging him to acknowledge the message hidden in the dog's alert posture. Jacob responded with a low murmur. "You sensed it too, didn't you? Someone was out there." Rex remained motionless at the comment, but the unbroken eye contact confirmed what Jacob already knew. Animals did not articulate threat, yet they never misread its shape. Jacob sat at the small kitchen table, the overhead light casting soft edges on the worn surface, and unfolded the scrap of paper containing the coordinates and numbers etched onto Rex's tag. His fingers hovered over the sequence as his mind retraced the day's events, rearranging them not as memories, but as data points. The car near the warehouse, the second vehicle trailing, the silhouette at the second-story window. Each fragment formed a pattern he could not yet interpret. He closed his eyes briefly and allowed old training to surface. Assess what you know, separate inference from fact. Avoid conclusions until evidence demands them. But the infant's faint whimper intruded on the mental exercise, grounding him in something larger than operational clarity. He rose, prepared a bottle with practiced calm, and fed the child while Rex settled at his feet, watchful and still. As Jacob supported the baby's head, he felt the tug of memory, not of war or comrades, but of something gentler and more fragile that he had once tried to build before deployments fractured time. He wondered if the instinct to protect had remained dormant until now, waiting not for orders, but for need. The baby's tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb with the same unquestioning certainty as before, and Jacob felt a mix of strength and dread swell in equal measure. Protection always carried cost. Outside, wind rattled loose ice along the building's siding, and Jacob turned toward the sound, his breath steady, yet his nerves taut. He checked the window cautiously, lifting a sliver of curtain. Across the street nothing obvious moved, yet his eyes lingered on a darkened sedan parked half a block down, too far to see clearly, though its placement struck him as deliberate, a shadow waiting for something to change. He lowered the curtain without comment, unwilling to stir Rex into a heightened state, before confirming danger. Returning to the table, Jacob unfolded the map once again. The coordinates pointed not only to the warehouse district, but also connected indirectly to a second location, marked faintly by contour lines near a series of decommissioned storage units east of the docks, a place he had not visited in years, back when Anchorage felt more like a destination and less like a threshold. If the warehouse represented origin, the storage site could represent continuation or disposal. He felt that thought settle heavily inside him, and his grip tightened unconsciously on the map's edge. Rex emitted a low sound, not quite a growl, more like breath filtered through caution. Jacob met the dog's gaze and nodded, as though replying to an unspoken question. "We're not done." The baby shifted again, soft sounds filling the apartment with a life he did not expect to share. Jacob rocked the infant gently until sleep returned, then stood in the quiet with a clarity forming. He could not protect the child simply by hiding behind locked doors. He needed to understand what thread connected Rex, the infant, and the warehouse district, and who else followed the thread toward him. He felt a quiet resolve form just beneath the layer of fear he refused to name. He placed Rex near the door on watch, double-checked windows and hall, then sat at the table once more, drawing lines on the map with a pencil. Routes, timelines, potential hiding spots someone might have used before abandoning a child to winter's edge. As he worked, the apartment settled into deep silence, the kind that emerges not from peace, but anticipation. Jacob caught himself tapping his thumb against the table in an old cadence once used to steady his breathing before infiltration assignments. He stopped, exhaled slowly. When he finally leaned back and rubbed the exhaustion from his eyes, the heater hummed a steady rhythm that felt like borrowed stability. He stared toward the crib and saw not just a child, but the stark reminder that someone had chosen a path of abandonment that ended on Jacob's doorstep. That choice linked them, even if he wanted no part of it. Rex lifted his head suddenly, ears angled toward the hallway. Jacob rose immediately, silent, steady, instincts snapping into place. A soft sound echoed beyond the door. Not footsteps, but something lighter, paper sliding. Jacob waited a full minute before moving, then opened the door just enough to see an envelope resting at the threshold, its surface unmarked but dampened slightly by melting frost. He reached for it with controlled breath, Rex tense behind him, and closed the door once the envelope was in hand. Inside the apartment's light, the envelope felt heavier than paper should, as though whatever message it contained would tilt everything he believed about what came next. He hesitated only once before breaking the seal, and when he saw the first line written in firm handwriting, his pulse hammered with renewed force. Someone knew his name. The envelope trembled faintly in Jacob's grip, though the movement did not come from his hand, but from the weight of what he imagined it might contain. He sat at the table with Rex near his side, and the baby asleep in the improvised crib, and for a long moment he simply stared at the letter's first line, reading it again and again, until the words carved themselves into his breath. You were not supposed to interfere. No signature, no address, no threat spelled out, yet the implication throbbed beneath each word like a buried current waiting to surface. The handwriting was deliberate, strong, but not rushed, and Jacob felt the unnerving certainty that whoever wrote it had expected him to recognize something, a name, a memory, a mark, But he did not. That absence weighed heavier than any threat could have. He placed the envelope flat on the table and leaned back, exhaling through clenched teeth. Rex watched him, muscles barely moving yet fully awake, as though sensing Jacob's unease through the air itself. Jacob ran a hand across his forehead, trying to steady his thoughts, but instead they tangled deeper. He had entered battles with less information than he had now, yet those missions carried structure, orders, maps, extraction points. Here, the map was incomplete, the enemy undefined, and the extraction point hadn't been written yet. The heater hummed and flickered, steady but modest, and Jacob felt its warmth reach him unevenly, like a reminder that stability was temporary. He unfolded the letter further, searching for hidden meaning, but nothing more appeared beyond a second line scrawled near the bottom. The child was never meant to stay. Jacob felt his jaw tighten as anger replaced confusion, but beneath the anger lay something harder to name, not just protectiveness, but a stubborn refusal to accept that any life could be assigned such conditional worth. He closed his eyes and breathed slowly, steadying the storm inside. Rex shifted closer, placing himself between Jacob and the front door, the gesture instinctive, calm, and deeply rooted. Jacob reached out and rested a hand on the dog's head, whispering a thought not meant for words. "I need to know what they want." The baby murmured softly, as if sensing the tension even in sleep, and Jacob moved to check the child's breathing, reassuring himself that warmth and life remained steady. His hands lingered longer than needed, not out of doubt, but from something else. The memory of all the times he wished he could have saved just one more person. He returned to the table and flattened the map fully. His pencil hovered over the new location he had traced earlier, the decommissioned storage units near the docks. The letter, the vehicles trailing him, the silent watcher in the warehouse window, they all aligned like gravity, pulling him toward that second point. He resisted the urge to move immediately. Night missions had taught him that darkness could be either shield or trap, and without knowing which one it was now, impulsiveness could cost more than he was willing to lose. He brewed a small pot of coffee, though his body didn't need the caffeine. His pulse was awake enough. As he drank, he let the bitter warmth fill him and forced his mind to ask the question that had lingered since Chapter 1. Why Rex? Why the child? Why now? The simplest explanation, coincidence, had already collapsed under evidence. Too many signals, too many patterns. Yet the most dangerous explanation, intention, remained incomplete. Someone wanted something, someone feared something, someone left traces that shouldn't have been found. The letter's phrasing echoed again. You were not supposed to interfere. He closed his eyes and let instinct translate what fear obscured. Interfere implied an unfolding plan. Not supposed implied someone assumed he would not be present. You implied that whoever wrote it knew exactly who he was. He opened his eyes sharply. That last realization hit deeper than the others. They didn't just know someone picked up the child, they knew Jacob Miller had. That narrowed the field of possibilities, and not in ways that comforted him. Rex let out a soft exhale, a near-silent signal Jacob recognized as attention shifting. The dog's gaze aimed at the front door. Jacob tensed. He placed one finger on the map, another on the letter, and rose with careful precision. He crossed the room without sound, checked the peephole, nothing but empty hallway. But absence did not equal safety. He returned to the table and turned off every visible light, leaving only the heater's glow. Darkness wrapped the room, soft but dense, and Jacob listened, to wind against the window, to Rex's breathing, to his own heartbeat, to footsteps that did not come. Minutes stretched in silence until Jacob finally sat again, his voice low. It's not over. Rex did not move, yet the message was received. Jacob picked up a pen and wrote 3 words on the back of the envelope where no one else would see. I won't stop. He stared at the phrase and felt something settle inside him, not peace, but resolve strong enough to hold back fear, at least for now. The baby stirred again, and Jacob rose with quiet purpose, cradling the child until the tiny fists loosened and sleep regained its fragile balance. As he stood there in the dark, the heater humming like a heartbeat behind him, he whispered a promise he had once feared to make. "I'll keep you safe no matter what it costs." When he returned to the table, he noticed something new, a faint smear of dirt on the floor near the entryway, small enough to miss unless searching for patterns. The mark curved slightly, as if from a boot pivoting during a quiet retreat. Jacob's pulse steadied rather than spiked. Whoever left the letter had not just approached his door, they had lingered. He traced the dirt with his fingertips, cold rising through him like truth. Someone knew where he lived, what he cared for, and how to reach him without being heard. He rose slowly, looked toward the crib, then toward the map. Rex watched him with eyes bright in the heater's low light. Jacob nodded to himself, to Rex, to the resolve forming like ice beneath winter sky. Morning would not wait. Neither would he. Morning light softened the edges of Anchorage as the wind finally tired and the city exhaled beneath a pale winter sky. Jacob watched the first thin band of daylight creep across the apartment floor and felt strangely exposed, as if the night's decision to keep going had been witnessed by something larger than his own conscience. The envelope lay where he had left it, its 2 lines of accusation and warning still echoing in his mind. And yet beneath that echo, another sound had begun to grow, quieter but steadier, the rhythm of the baby's breathing and the soft rise of Rex's chest as the dog dozed in a posture that was not true sleep. Jacob understood that neither of them would rest until he gave this fear a name and a form. He knew isolation was no longer a viable tactic. He had spent months hiding from his own ghosts and had only grown more hollow. Hiding from living threats while cradling a child felt like cowardice, and whatever else he might be, he refused to be that. When the clock crept past 7, he strapped the child into the carrier with practiced care, feeling the instant calm that came whenever small weight pressed close to his heart, and called the clinic's number. The doctor answered with the weary alertness of someone used to early emergencies, and Jacob's voice was steady as he requested a meeting in person, adding just enough urgency to make refusal unlikely. Within an hour he was back in the same modest building near downtown, Rex pacing in small, controlled arcs outside the exam room, while Jacob laid the letter, the map, and his unease on the doctor's desk. He spoke carefully, trimming away speculation, and leaving only what he knew: the baby found in the snow, Rex's unwavering guardianship, the coordinates on the collar, the warehouse district, the trailing cars, the silent watcher, the line about interference. The doctor listened without interruption, then rubbed a hand along his jaw in thought, the way a man does when confronted with something that does not fit his usual categories. "I know someone who handles cases where things fall between the cracks," he finally said, and placed a call to a contact at Child Protective Services. Within an hour, a woman arrived, coat still dusted with snow, carrying a worn notebook and the efficient calm of someone long accustomed to emergencies that never made the news. Her name was Karen Doyle, a social worker who had spent years in Anchorage following the trail of children who slipped through systems more often than they should. Jacob watched her evaluate the baby with gentle hands and sharp eyes, then scan the letter and the map, her questions brief and pointed. When she asked him why he had waited to contact authorities, the answer settled on his tongue, heavier than he expected. "Because I have seen what happens when people become paperwork instead of lives," he said, "and because I was afraid they would take the child before they understood what was behind all of this." Karen studied him for a long breath, then nodded, not in agreement, but in recognition. She had likely seen men like him before, Soldiers who had learned to trust action over procedure, grief over protocol. "You did bring the baby in," she replied quietly. "You did not walk away." "That matters. But now, we need more than instinct. We need documentation, and we need law behind it." Through Karen, Jacob's information reached a detective unit that handled organized crimes in the port area. The names did not matter to him as much as the shift in energy he felt when questions turned from whether to intervene to how. Over the next days, as the city moved through its routines under a low winter sun, an investigation unfolded mostly out of his sight. Karen visited frequently, sometimes alone, sometimes with a plainclothes officer who asked him to retell details, checking for cracks. Jacob answered with the same precision he had once used in after-action reports, aware that every small recollection could become a hinge on which justice turned. All the while, his bond with the child and the dog deepened with a natural inevitability that both comforted and frightened him. He did not yet know the baby's legal name, only the clinic identifier and file number, yet in his mind a word had begun to surface, uninvited and persistent: hope. He kept it to himself at first, as if naming might be a promise too large, but his heart had already spoken. Rex, for his part, adapted to each new visitor by reading not their appearance, but the temperature of their intent. He relaxed only when Karen arrived, his instincts declaring her safe long before Jacob's logic caught up. When uniformed officers came once to collect the envelope and photograph the dirt trace near the door, Rex watched with guarded stillness, acknowledging that sometimes danger could wear badges and sometimes protection could too, and that he would trust only behavior, not symbols. One evening, Karen arrived with a different kind of tension in her shoulders, the kind that came from conclusions rather than questions. She sat at Jacob's small table, notebook closed beside her, hands folded on its worn surface. "They raided the storage units and part of the warehouse strip," she said. "They found records, medical supplies, falsified adoption papers. It was not just one child. You were right to act." Jacob felt cold rise in him despite the heater's steady hum. He did not ask for details, knowing some pains were necessary to acknowledge, yet not to collect. "The people who left that letter," he asked instead, voice low, "did they find them?" Karen hesitated, then nodded. "Some of them. Enough to stop what they were doing here. But there will always be others in other cities. That is not on you." He looked at the crib where the baby slept, Rex curled nearby in a protective arc, and thought of all the lives that had not found a former seal on a frozen street at the right moment. Guilt stirred, then shifted into something more bearable, less about what he had failed to prevent, and more about what he could still choose to do. The next question he asked came from a place more vulnerable than any battlefield wound. What happens to the child now? Karen took a breath, the kind a person takes before speaking truth that may hurt. "By law, the baby enters protective custody," she said. "There will be hearings, genetic tests, attempts to identify any living relatives. Foster care is the default path when none can be found." The word foster landed like a verdict. Jacob pictured an endless series of unfamiliar rooms, temporary beds, new faces that changed too often. He knew foster care could save lives, yet he also knew systems could not replicate the specific bond forming in this small apartment. "And if someone wishes to be more than a witness," he heard himself say, "if someone wishes to stay, to be part of whatever comes next." Karen studied him again, but this time the assessment was softer, tinged with something almost protective. "Then that someone has a long road of background checks, interviews, home visits," she replied. "Especially someone with a service history like yours. The question is not just whether you are willing, it is whether you understand how much of yourself you will have to lay bare." Jacob glanced at Rex, then at the carrier, then at his own hands, scarred in ways visible and invisible. "I spent years letting strangers decide what I was worth," he said. "If the price of giving this child a stable home is that I answer hard questions, I can live with that." The months that followed did not move quickly, but they moved with intention. Jacob submitted to evaluations, filled out forms that asked him to describe traumas he had spent a decade trying not to name, and opened his apartment to visits that examined whether it could hold more than one life. Rex remained part of the calculus, his loyalty tested and noted, his presence strangely comforting to officials who had seen too many children without any kind of guardian. The investigation into the trafficking ring produced headlines Jacob did not read. What mattered to him unfolded in quieter rooms. A judge reviewing documents, a caseworker noting how the baby calmed in Jacob's arms, a physician confirming that the child, now healthier and growing, recognized his voice with unmistakable trust. On a day when winter finally loosened its grip and the snow outside the apartment had receded into dirty banks along the sidewalks, Karen arrived carrying more than a notebook. She held a folder thick with signatures and seals, and her expression, for once, betrayed unguarded relief. "They approved a kinship-style placement," she said, explaining that while no blood ties connected Jacob to the child, the court acknowledged the bond forged by circumstance and effort. "It is not a fairy tale. There will be reviews, ongoing oversight. But for now, this is home, legally as well as practically." Jacob heard the words as if from underwater, yet the meaning was clear enough to pierce any fog. He looked at the baby in the crib, at the dog standing now with quiet anticipation, and felt a line inside him break, then reform into something stronger. "Her name is Hope," he said quietly, the word finally given voice. "I know that is not what is on the paperwork, but that is who she is to me." Karen smiled, a small, tired curve that spoke of too many difficult cases and too few endings like this. "Then let us make sure Hope has a life that proves her name right," she replied. Years later, Jacob would not remember every detail of that day, but he would remember the feeling of signing documents that did not discharge him from duty, but invited him into it. He would remember Rex circling once around the crib as if claiming this new reality as his post, and he would remember standing by the window as evening settled, watching Anchorage glow in the soft light of a city that had no idea a battle had been fought and won in a small apartment above its streets. That night, he took Hope into his arms, Rex lying near his feet like a sentry at ease, and felt for the first time in years that his life was not defined by the men he could not save, but by the one child and one dog he had. The letter remained in a drawer, its sharp lines dulled by time, not as a threat, but as a reminder of a road he chose not to abandon. When he lay down to sleep, he did so, knowing winter would return, that danger would always exist somewhere beyond the walls. But inside, where a child breathed softly and a dog watched with unwavering devotion, Jacob Miller had found a new kind of mission, one not ordered by any commanding officer, yet binding all the same, to never again turn away when life asked him to stay. In the hush that followed Jacob's choice to stay, a gentle truth rose from the quiet like warmth through winter wood. Sometimes miracles do not crash into our lives as thunder or fire, but arrive as small breaths and steady pause, as one child rescued from the cold and one weary soul learning to love again. In stories told around kitchen tables or whispered in late-night prayers, people say God moves through burning bushes or parted seas. Yet here, in the ordinary snow of an ordinary city, grace revealed itself in simple acts. A man who did not walk away, a dog who refused to abandon his post, and a child whose fragile heartbeat rewrote the meaning of purpose. Those who watched from afar might call it chance or luck, but the old voices of faith remind us that miracles are just compassion we dare to carry forward. Jacob did not save the world. He saved one life. and somewhere in heaven, that was enough to shake a star loose from the sky. As you step back into your own days of bills, obligations, quiet disappointments, and small victories, remember this: the divine often hides inside everyday decisions. The moment we choose kindness instead of indifference, action instead of silence, love instead of fear. And who knows, perhaps the next miracle waits in your hands, in your street, in your willingness to stay when walking away would be easier. If this story stirred your heart, let it travel farther. Comment your thoughts. Your voice might encourage someone who feels alone. Share this story. You never know whose hope it might restore. Subscribe to the channel. Together, we keep these small miracles alive. And may the Lord watch over every pair of hands that chooses compassion, every heart that refuses to give up, and every soul who believes that love, even quiet, imperfect love, can rewrite a life. God bless you.